My name is Jim. I'm a volunteer here at ECV. My usual paying gig is down the street. I teach mathematics to college students, but I'm super glad to occasionally be able to be in front of you talking about various things such as being stuck in life. And so the question that we're asking today is, what happens? How do you handle? What do you do? How do you engage when you are stuck in life? Now, to give a little bit of context of where we are and where we're headed in this current series, we're in a series called The Shaping of a Leader. It happens to be the leader, David, as a matter of fact. Josh started us off last week with that. So I think there's a couple of things to ask. What's a leader? And so I don't know what you have in mind. You may think of Steve Jobs. You may think of political leaders. You may think of governmental leaders, which I guess are the same thing. You may think of technical leaders. You may think of business leaders. You may think of military leaders. Maybe you think, as I do, of William Wallace in Braveheart leading the charge to bring people to freedom. We're defining leadership in this particular series as simply someone who has influence. So do you have influence? So maybe you're a mom. You have influence over your kids. Maybe you have friends where you have influence. Maybe you have coworkers where you have influence. Maybe you're a boss and you have influence. Maybe you have official or unofficial kinds of influence. But the case that we're making over the course of this series is that everyone has a sphere of influence in some form or some fashion at some point in time in their life. And so if we are leaders in some form, some fashion at some time and some points in our life, how does God shape us into inform us and transform us so that we can be effective leaders? And so there's a difference between being the shape of a leader, which is not the title of this series, and the shaping of a leader. And so this points to what we're trying to accomplish here. We're not trying to give you the 1, 2, 3 steps to being a great leader, because let's face it, there aren't simply 1, 2, 3 steps that work for everybody. We're simply trying to point to a process that God tends to work in different people. And we're using the life of David to understand how that process worked in his life. And then ask the question, is there some part of that that may be for me in all of this? So the shaping of a leader. Now, you need a little bit of historical context to understand where we've been and where we're headed in this series. And so as a mathematician, I'm about to show you a graph. Yes, I do. There's not very often I can sneak this into a sermon, but I'm doing it today. So I'm calling this Israel's QLQ, Quality of Life Quotient. And so the reality is that there's been a period with the people of Israelites where there's been judges that have been leading Israel in some fashion. So the idea is this. God gave his laws to Moses, passed down to the people of Israel, and the judges are figures whose job was to administrate and mediate the laws of God. But God was ultimately the king and the leader over Israel. But it turns out this really didn't go so well and became a period of chaos, not a period of transformation. And so the people said, gosh, we really want a king over us. We're tired of you, God, being our king. We really want somebody to be a human to be our king so that we can be just like all the other nations. We're tired of being distinctive. We're tired of being different. We really want somebody just like the other nations. We want a king. And oh, by the way, we want this king to go fight for us, to go into battle and lead our armies into battle so they can protect, defend, and get us in our way of life. We want to make Israel great again. And so this is where Saul comes in. Eventually, Saul was chosen. He was a handsome young man. He was known as a head taller than everybody else in Israel. And as it is usually the case with many leaders, there was a period, there's a bit of a honeymoon phase where things went pretty well for Saul. But that didn't last very long. And then chaos turns into crisis and the descent of the quality of life, and I'm using that to mean the life of Israel in every possible way, spiritual, religious, economic, political, and in every possible way, things continue to descend. And as Josh talked about last week, in the midst of crisis, God gives a calling. And the calling is to the person of David. And in contrast to Saul, Scripture says in 1 Samuel 16, the Lord does not look at the things that people look at. Remember, Saul was handsome and tall. The Lord looks at the heart. And so one thing that I really am looking forward to in this series is I can relate to David in many ways. Not every way, but in many ways. David was a passionate guy. He loved God with all of his heart. And out of this flowed many beautiful songs and poems, which we have record today in the book that we call Psalms. And we study these things. We try to understand these things because we want to understand the God that David understood. David is a passionate man for God. He also is a passionate man for women. He was a sexually prolific guy, had many wives, many wives. And they had the famous story of David and Bathsheba as he seduces or maybe exercises power over, depending on your point of view, Bathsheba on the roof. Then he covers up his sin, and then he goes on to have other wives, children, etc., etc. He's a passionate man for women. He's also a passionate person for war. He loves to fight, he loves to win, and he does a lot of this. And so what I see in this passion for God, passion for women, passion for war, is somebody who on the one hand has certain things together. They do some things well, but then in some other parts of their lives, things are just falling apart in many ways. And I personally, I don't know about you, I'm sure not many of you can relate to this, but I can relate to this particular point of view, which is why I'm excited about this series in front of us. And so the interesting thing is, in the calling in the midst of crisis is this turns out to be an inflection point in the quality of life for Israel. And as a mathematician, we have a pretty specific definition of what an inflection point is, and I won't bother you with the details of that. But I'm going to suggest to you that an inflection point is where something changes, subtle, perhaps nuanced, even when it's not apparent in the world around you that something's changed. So if you look at the graph, the descent is going down. It's going down at a rapid pace. And at the point where David and his calling occurs, you see how the graph begins to slow down as it descends? It still descends, but it begins to slow down. And things are set in motion at the calling of David at this inflection point that ultimately, when he becomes king, at the very bottom, things are prepared. He has been prepared for things to begin to change. And so we are focusing in particular over the next few weeks on this particular point in his life between calling and between kingship. That's where we're headed over the next few weeks. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm talking about David and Goliath. Now, this is one of probably the most famous stories in Scripture, arguably. And you know what the story is, right? It's little guy versus big guy, nobody versus somebody. It's powerless against the powerful. It's our baseball team yesterday against West Hartford. We lost 15-1. So actually, we were the Davids who didn't beat Goliath in that particular situation. But this is a pretty common understanding of David. And this is, of course, reflected in Scripture. But as true in many, many good stories, the real juice, the real nuggets is in the backstory. And as a matter of fact, we're going to look at 50 verses, hopefully fairly quickly, or parts of 50 verses over the next few minutes. And it turns out that only the last 10 verses, 20% of the 50 verses, is affiliated with the traditional story of David and Goliath. That's the actual engagement when David takes out his slingshot, and he whoops Goliath by hitting him in the forehead with a stone. Only 20% of the story is the common story that we understand. 80% of the story is the backstory, the preparation that leads to this particular moment in time. And so I'm going to focus on the backstory, and this is why I'm calling this particular talk Stuck. Because what we're about to see is that, in fact, David's life is in some regards stuck. Saul's life is very stuck, and the people of Israel in general are just flat stuck. Okay, let's see how this rolls out. I'm going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to have excerpts from that on the screen above. But if you want to track with me in your own Bible, that would certainly be an interesting thing to do. Okay. What's next? Okay, yeah. The question we're asking, as I've already mentioned, what parts of our life are stuck? So let's see how this works for David, Israel, and Saul. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soka and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up the battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley in between. So you have this picture, the valley of Elah. It's a very, very wide valley. one army, the Philistines, takes the high ground on one side of the valley. The Israelites take the high ground on the other side of the valley, and they are stuck right there. And it turns out, we're going to see in a few verses, that they had been in this particular position for 40 days. There's something else going on behind the scenes, behind the backstory, and it's this. The Philistines are not new people in the story of Israel and David. They've been around. And in fact, Jonathan and his son Saul had engaged them in war and skirmishes over and over and over. And they haven't gone away. They haven't defeated them. They have been on the periphery of Israel with incursions in, battles and out. Incursions in, battles and out. And Saul had not defeated them. Now, I don't know how you think about things. Sometimes in my own life, there are issues on the periphery of my life that I don't quite deal with. And they keep coming around and coming around. And then they are little skirmishes. And then all of a sudden, perhaps I have a more substantive problem on my hands if I don't deal with them. And this is exactly the situation. In fact, if Saul does not deal with the situation now, they walk into Israel and they conquer Israel. That's what's at stake for Saul. Next slide. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. People say between 7 and 9 feet tall. He's a big deal. A really big deal. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels, 125 pounds or so. Big guy with big armor. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. So it's not just 7 to 9 foot tall Goliath, it's 7 to 9 foot Goliath with the latest technology, 125 pounds of armor on his body, and a spear that probably weighed 15, the tip of the spear itself weighed 15 pounds. This is not a spear that you throw at people. It's a spear that you take and you ruthlessly stab into people, and you pull it out and you stab it into the next person over and over and over and over again. This is a powerful, violent man. Big deal, big armor, big power with the latest technology. But there's something else going on beyond that. There's psychological warfare at hand. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? So the ritual was this. The Philistines would come up and line up for battle. And so, of course, Israel had to respond, right? They didn't want to get taken over. So they come down. The champion, Goliath, comes out and starts yelling at them, saying, would you send a man out of Israel? Who is going to come out and fight me? So the tradition is this. Instead of everybody fighting in mass chaos, they would send out one person from each side, and whoever won the battle between that one person, the other side would be considered defeated. So the champion, Goliath, is coming and saying, hey, who is this man that you will send out? If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects in service. Then the Philistines said, this day I defy the armies of God. Give me a man and let us fight with each other. On hearing the Philistines' word, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Two armies stuck on one hill versus the other hill. And who's supposed to deal with this? You remember when the people of Israel years ago said, we want a king, and why did they want a king? Because we want to be like all the other nations, and we want somebody to fight for us in battle. Saul himself is stuck right now. He's a head taller than everybody else. So who would naturally be the person to fight Goliath? He, of course, is a king, and he ought to be doing it because he's king, but he's also a head taller than everybody else. So we see on top of this, Saul is stuck, the armies are stuck. And then in verse 16, for 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. So this has been going on a long time. Since before they actually got on the hillsides of the valley of Elah, the Philistines had been annoying and bothering Israel for many years. Now that they're there, Saul has a problem. He can either fight Goliath, and his fear is that he will lose. He can go home, and the problem with that is the Philistines will come into the land, or he can stay put and stay stuck. The problem with staying put is this. It doesn't change anything, of course. That's the obvious thing. But it costs money. He has to pay for the food for his armies. He has to pay for the livestock to be cared for. And they've been there for 40 days. And it's pretty clear, as we're going to see in a few minutes, that money has begun to run out. And families have begun to send food to the front lines because Saul is unable to do this. So the risk of staying put is that it causes great pain and difficulty on the people back at home, not just the soldiers, but it bleeds back to the people at home. And then on top of that, when do the armies go to war? They go to war in the spring, which is exactly the same time when people plant their crops. So who plants the crops? The men and boys who are currently stuck on the front lines in the valley of Elah. So, do you ever feel in your own life that you're stuck? You're in a relationship you don't know how to get out of, you don't know how to move forward in. Getting out of it has risk, staying put has risk, trying to forge forward has risk. Maybe you're in a profession and you just feel stuck, just not going anywhere. What do you do? What's on the next slide? Yeah, oh yeah. How do you, I guess, yeah, maybe let's just change the pace here. What do you do when you're confronted by a big deal? You know, a Goliath kind of deal. So I'm going to give you 5 options. I'm going to try not to knock over the communion elements. 5 options here. What do you do? So let's figure out how we might respond, and then we'll look at see how David responded in all of this. So do you respond when confronted by a big deal like Goliath, like a turtle? You withdraw? Like a dog in a corner, you bite. Like an ostrich, you stick your head in the sand and you pretend like nothing's happening. Or like a peacock where you squawk a little bit, you show everybody your stuff, and then you put it down and you go on. Or you just maybe you're not a bleep, 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 bleep animal. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got 5 fingers for a minute. So let's think about this. How do you tend to respond? Anybody? On 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm seeing some 3s. I'm seeing some 3s. Yeah, I'm a 3. I'm seeing some 1s. I'm seeing a 4 back there. Yep, no 5s, 1s, 3s. 1, 3s, and 4s. All right, that's the famous. Okay, let's see, in fact, how David responded. What's next? Okay, yep. Okay, verse 17. Now Jesse said to his son David, so Jesse's the dad, David's the son. Also, we skipped a few verses. There are 8 kids. David is the 8th. Eliab is the oldest. And Abinadab is the 2nd, and the 3rd is Shema. And David is the very youngest. So the dad, Jesse, says to his son David, who is not on the front lines while his brothers are, take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of the unit. See how your brothers are doing and bring back some assurance from them. Well, of course, your dad, and you can see that the reality is that the family has to send food to the front lines here. And of course the dad's going to want to know, how are my boys doing? I really want to know. I'm concerned, as any dad would be. See how your brothers are doing and bring back assurance from them. There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. So, a couple of thoughts about this particular passage. The one thought is I think it's pretty plain. It's just facts, right? Just facts. Hey, Dad, here's some cheese, here's some bread. Take it to the front lines. Check on my boys. And then David does that, basically. But in the plainness of all of this, there's something interesting going on. And you have to remember where David is before this happens. You have the calling that happened 3 or 4 years ago. In some regards, David gets his king card, right? He gets anointed, he gets his king card. And so what does he do with his king card? He could go out and say, hey, he goes to the local Starbucks, hey, here's my king card. Just sort of slide it out there. Hey, maybe I can get a free venti latte. No, he doesn't do that. Or maybe he can bring out his king card when he meets an attractive woman and say, hey, Asia Brown, here's my king card. Hey, would you like to spend some time with me? No, he doesn't bring out his king card, as a matter of fact. He's living a life of monotony, obscurity, and solitude. He takes his king card and puts it in his pocket and does nothing with it. And in some regards, maybe professionally we could say at least, he is stuck himself. Life isn't really seeming to go anywhere for him. He is out in the field with his sheep, doing whatever shepherds do, watching a lot of stars at night, writing a few songs and poems, goes back the next day, and he's living a very monotonous, solitary, boring life, perhaps. And what we're going to begin to see in this passage that we're reading here is that this is exactly when God begins to move and shape and transform him and begins the shaping process for him to become an effective leader 15 years down the road from when the calling process begins. 15 years. And so what I see in the plainness and the monotony of this particular passage right here is three sort of crucial phrases. He left the flock in the care of a shepherd. He's a responsible dude. He gets there, and then he doesn't just drop everything, all the supplies he's just brought to go check on his brothers. He makes sure that the keeper of those supplies has them. And then he does exactly what his dad has asked him to do. He checks and sees how his brothers are doing. So maybe we can say this, that one of the things that happens in David's preparation for being a leader who gets things unstuck is this. He becomes a responsible person versus an undependable person. Now, I have to confess, being a responsible person is not unique to being a follower of Jesus. It's not. Anybody can be a responsible person, and anybody can be an unresponsible person. But the point is that this is, in fact, this character-building stuff on the surface doesn't seem like sexy spirituality. It just doesn't. But in fact, this is part of the very stuff that allows David to confront Goliath, the very big deal in the last 20% of our story. And so clearly the Spirit of God, and I think this is what the narrator is trying to tell us, the Spirit of God has been working to produce responsibility in his life. Let's move on. As he was talking to them, his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So up until this point, the stories about Goliath had no doubt trickled back home. But now David viscerally experiences this fear and this intimidation, this big deal in other people's life, and he sees it for what it is. Okay, we go on. Now the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king, that would be Saul, will give him great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. So three things: great wealth, his daughter in marriage, and exempt his family from taxes. So money, sex, and power. If you marry the daughter of the king, that means you're a part of the king's family, which means you have power. You marry the daughter of the king, you get sex, free sex. If you get exempt from taxes, you have great wealth. So what is Saul doing? He is using extrinsic motivations to do the thing that he is unable to do himself. Now you remember what God said, I do not look at the external things, I look at the heart. And so what is Saul doing? He is using external things to motivate people, which is exactly the point of the narrator. David is motivated by something very, very different. And if we continue to read, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine, who removes this disgrace from Israel? There is a moral imperative, there's a holy indignation. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? So we see another thing that's been happening over time is that there's been an intrinsic motivation that God has been building inside of David under the months and months and months under the stars with just his sheep, with just his staff, with just his slingshot. There is a holy imperative. And so when this confrontation happens, when he viscerally understands and sees Goliath for the first time, he gets not the fear, and he's not motivated by money, sex, and power, but by this holy oughtness, this imperative that this is not right and I must do something about it. Now, I don't know about you. I'm motivated by external motivators. I'm motivated by internal motivators. I'm motivated by lots of things, sometimes which are in conflict with each other. As parents, Ann and I have 2 kids. Most of you have seen our kids running around. And when it comes time to doing chores, making the bed, eating food that doesn't have 32 cups of sugar in it, we use a lot of extrinsic motivators to make sure that happens. We use both carrots and sticks. But my son doesn't need any motivation to go out and shoot baskets all hours of the night. He just loves to do it, and so he does it. My daughter doesn't need any motivation to draw pretty pictures and to write interesting stories. She says, after school's out, I'm going to write some beautiful story, I'm sure. And so we see in our life around us, there are extrinsic motivators that can be effective, but the intrinsic ones, the ones that are going to last the longest, and the ones that are going to carry us to places that we could not possibly have thought of. And so we see this character quality being built inside of David. All right, let's keep moving. Let me tell you one other thing here that I think is actually important to the story. I've on many occasions talked about the fact that Ann and I have struggled with infertility for 10 years. Adopted James. Julie came 6 months later. Woohoo! It's great. So Father's Day is a poignant day for us because we understand the pain of going to many Father's Days and wanting to be dads and moms and not being able to. And we understand the joy of it. So we understand both sides of this. Well, at one point in our infertility process, it was particularly painful events, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but a very good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, sat me down and said, Jim, will you linger in this pain that you're feeling right now? And at the time, I just, okay, Randy, I know you've been through this. He was a guy that was in his mid-40s, had a mental emotional breakdown, and literally had to wear diapers for a while because he had no control over his bladder. I met him 20 years post that event. And so you meet somebody that's been through a mental and emotional breakdown, that's come through it and lived on the other side. You know that they know and understand something about pain that I just simply don't know. And so when this man tells me, Jim, would you be willing to linger in the pain? I just nod my head and say, okay, there's something there. I don't really understand it. And the truth be told, it took at least 2 years, maybe longer, to really begin to grasp what he was saying. And I think as it relates to this story, there's something about external motivations and intrinsic motivations that are at play here. If I'm motivated by external things, when pain comes along, what do I want to do? I want to get rid of this thing that's causing me pain. I want to find things to replace that if I'm motivated externally. But if I am motivated intrinsically, I'm able to withstand the pain and the difficulties of the moment and begin to grasp the juice, the good stuff that God has for me in the very midst of that, and grow and become shaped and transformed so that when I must confront the big deal, there's something extra, there's something substantive, there's something inside of me that God has put there that simply was not there if I'm motivated extrinsically. And I think this is a part of what's going on inside of David. We're going to see he's going to experience some pain in just a few verses here. So where are we? 28? Yeah, David continued to ask the men standing near him what will be done. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that defies God? They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. When Eliab, David's eldest brother, someone who knows David well, somebody who is close to David, presumably, when Eliab, David's eldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at David and asked, why have you come down here? Well, the narrator has made it crystal clear why he's there. His dad has asked him to be there. He is there because he is a responsible man. He is there because he is a man after God's heart at this point in his life. He is doing the things that he is being asked to do in a responsible way, in a motivated in an intrinsic way, but yet somebody who is close to him is questioning his heart. Now, I don't know about you, but I can hurt the people that are close to me the most. I can be hurt by the people that I care for the most. And I think right in this moment, when all of a sudden David is doing nothing but exactly what he's been asked to do, his brother questions his integrity and questions his motivation and says, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep? Those few sheep, you are a nobody, in other words. With whom did you leave the few sheep in the wilderness? Well, of course, the narrator's already told us he has been a responsible guy. He's left them with another shepherd. I know how conceited you are. Oh my gosh, and how wicked your heart is. But in fact, the narrator has been very clear that it is exactly where David excels at this point in his life. It is in the matters of his heart, and yet his older brother, the one who is close to him, questions this. You only have come down to watch the battle. Now what have I done, said David. Can I not even speak? And you just feel the frustration and the anxiety oozing out of these verses. So here's the story. David is a responsible guy. He's simply been doing what he's been asked to do. He is confronted with this visceral reality, this big deal, this fear, this intimidation, and there's something that rises up in him that I must do something about this. And yet out of the blue comes this big hammer. It says, squish, you are nothing. And this is a humongous distraction, I think. It would be for me, for David. It is probably for David. But how does he respond? He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. The man answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on the account of this Philistine. Your servant, that's me, I'll go fight him. And so what I see in this little paragraph right here is this. David understands what the main thing is, and he keeps the main thing the main thing. He remains focused instead of being distracted, as I no doubt would have been, by the pain that enters into his life due to his brother Eliab. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep in the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. And here's the key. The Lord, who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. So you see this little exercise that David is engaging in right now? He has the presence about him to step back. He steps back and he reflects. Instead of reacting to the moment, instead of reacting and trying to chop off Eliab's head, he keeps the main thing the main thing. He moves forward. He keeps his purpose that God has called him to in front of him. Excuse me. And then he begins to reflect. And I think at this point, when he begins to reflect and to remember instead of to react, what this does is this opens up his imaginations, the possibility of seeing things the way that God sees them and not the way that Goliath sees them and not the way that Saul sees them. I think this gives credence to what happened in the very next verses. Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I mean, this is just an incredulous kind of story. Saul, a head taller than anybody in Israel, not even counting small David, who's yet still a teenager, putting Saul's armor, putting him on David, expecting him to take that armor out. No, it's not working. And because I think that David has the ability to step back and think about how God has protected him and how God has taken care of him over and over in front of the lion and from the bear. He has the presence of mind to say, no, God will take care of me just as he has made me to be. That is, as a shepherd. I cannot go on these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. And so we see in this moment, as David goes out to confront the big deal, he chooses authenticity as a leader instead of copying something that somebody else, somewhere else, at some other point in time has done. He chooses to be himself, who God has made him to be. Then he took off his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag and a sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. He took his staff, a shepherd's staff, put them in the stones in his shepherd bag. And at that moment, we're no longer in preparation mode. He chooses to step out towards the Philistine. Eugene Peterson talks about this scene in one of his books. And he makes the point. So David is in a dry stream bed in the middle of the Valley of Elah. The Philistines are on one side, Israelites are on the other side. Everybody can see him. He does not have 125 pounds of armor on him. He does not have a shield bearer with him. He chooses to kneel down in a position of vulnerability and risk. In that moment, he chooses to be who God has made him to be. I don't know about you. I don't know if I could have done that. To make myself vulnerable, to choose to throw away the very things that could protect me, the very things that could defend me, to choose to go out solo and fight this big deal, this powerful man with the latest technology and the latest psychological warfare at play. I don't know if I could have done that. But he did. I have a friend of mine. His name is Jimmy Ben. Yep, Jimmy Ben is a friend of mine. I'm from Central Texas, from the South. In other words, Jimmy Ben. Frequently, we have two names in the South. And Jimmy Ben's a good friend of mine. I met him while I was a college student at Baylor University. Jimmy Ben's a few years older than me. He is a great guy. I've known him for many, many years at this point. He was in my wedding. He's somebody that loves Jesus dearly. When I met him, he was a student at Texas State Technical Institute while I was a student at Baylor. And TSTI is a place where people go to get vocational degrees typically. So that means that it's people that work hard. They work all day so they can go to school at night. And Jimmy Ben was one of these people. He's a blue-collar guy. He was a terrific guy. He's one of my dearest friends in my whole life, honestly, and he still is. Jimmy Ben was studying computer programming. I'm at Baylor. Middle to middle upper class students, white students mostly. I used to say before I was married, there's more beauty per square inch on the campus of Baylor University than anywhere in the world. So why would I not want to live in Waco and be close to Baylor and so I can find a wife? But I am glad to say that I found a beautiful, wonderful wife in North Carolina. But this was sort of the ethos of the moment, right? So you have this place where the beautiful people, I do not consider myself one of those, but there was a lot of really great people. So what did Jimmy Ben want to do? Of course, he wanted to come over to Baylor and hang out with these people that were, in some regards, different than him, from no other fact than we went to different schools, right? So he would come over, and we would eat lunch frequently in the dining halls of Baylor University, and Jimmy Ben had the hope that he could meet somebody that would become his future significant other. 2 months before Jimmy Ben was to finish his computer programming degree, he said, I quit. I'm done. And me and a couple other guys, we were all good friends, we said, Jimmy Ben, come on, just finish it out, man. Just finish the degree, and you can go on and do whatever it is that you want to do after that. And he said, nope, I'm done. And he quit. Well, Jimmy Ben knocked about a number of odd jobs. He fixed bicycles, had a small business for a while that eventually failed. He painted a few houses. He did this, he did that. The one thing about Jimmy Ben is this. He is an unbelievable mechanic. He can wrench like nobody's business. So the other day when my car is not running, I call him up. I say, Jimmy Ben, can we FaceTime? He says, yeah. So here's the deal. What do you think? And he walks me through the fixing of the engine over FaceTime. You know, he's that good a mechanic. But the problem is, Jimmy Ben didn't want to be a mechanic because that was too closely associated with the TSTI crowd and not the Baylor crowd where he really wanted to be. And so he spends a lot of his life going from thing to thing to thing, not wanting to be a mechanic. So he decided at one point, hey, I can be a motorcycle mechanic. That's a step up in the wrenching tier. So he goes to motorcycle mechanic school in Phoenix, spends 2 years there, spends a lot of money, comes back, you know what he does? Quits that. And so he knocks around on a few more odd jobs, and then he decides, maybe I should be a missionary. So he goes to missionary training school for 2 years. Of course, all of these are very great things to do. And so he goes to missionary training school for 2 years, spends time, spends money there. Jimmy Ben is a man after God's heart. He truly, truly is. He's one of my dearest friends. He winds up in Afghanistan shortly after 2011, 9/11. I have immense respect for this, but a few months after he arrives in Afghanistan, I get a phone call at 2 a.m. when we lived in Colorado saying, hey, I'm struggling, man. I'm struggling. And I said, oh, dude, what can I do for you? And of course, we talked, we prayed, we tried to find some practical things, ways to get him support while he was on the field, and he gave up. He came back home. I respect what he did immensely. He comes home and he knocks around, odd job to odd job, doing everything he can to avoid being the man that God had made him to be. And so a year and a half ago, he's approaching his 50s. And of course, when this happens for Jimmy Ben, as it does, I'm sure, with many people, you begin to think and you begin to reflect and begin to think, who am I? He had no coin, no career, no woman. No woman, the thing that he has been searching for, in particular, for 20 to 25 years. Now, I'm not a woman, so I ask my wife about these things, and she says, Jim, of course no woman would want to marry him. He has no meaningful job. He has no coin. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so this thing that he's been trying to escape is providing a barrier between the thing that he wants the most in his life. Well, he reconnected after 25 years with a woman he knew during his time at TSTI. This was a year ago, this past January. And she said, Jimmy, after connecting online, a few visits, she said, Jimmy Ben, come live in Colorado. Come woo me, whatever that means. Come to Colorado, and we're going to see what this thing looks like. And Jimmy Ben is so excited. He's emailing me and all his buddies saying, I think this is the one. I think this is the one. I think this is the one. And so he literally sells absolutely everything, including his beloved truck. If you're from Texas, you understand the truck is kind of an important kind of feature in your life. He sells his beloved truck because his woman, Danya, says, that's not a cool thing. You need to have a little Honda. And so he did it because she wanted him to do it. Well, he gets there, and here's what happens. She begins to almost daily try to change him into who she wants him to be. Those dusty jeans you have on, Jimmy Ben, no, man, you need to go buy some new shoes, some new pants. That grease underneath your fingers, I don't really like that. And so what happens in the few weeks that he was in Colorado is this became a clarifying experience for him. And he came to the realization that he needed to confront this big deal in his life and to reach down and pick up those 5 smooth stones in the dry riverbed of Eli and say, I've got to be who God has made me to be. And he did that. And he left behind the thing that he wants most in life at this point. He drove back to Central Texas and said, I'm going to be who God's made me to be. And he's wrenching. He's wrenching right now. He's fixing cars. He sells them, tries to make a little bit of living. He is still, though, in this place where he begins to approach Goliath. But it's not quite over yet. But he knows exactly who God has made him to be. So finally, David picks up the 5 smooth stones with a sling in his hand. He approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. And David said, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole army will know that there is a God in Israel. All those who are gathered here will know that there is not by sword nor spear that the Lord saves. So the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. And the Philistine moved closer to attack him, and David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. The story today is not the 20% that I just read, the last 10 verses. The story today is the 80% that happens in the years that lead up to that moment. So the question I have for you is this: is there something stuck in life, your life or the life around you? Are there any distractions, perhaps, the periphery of life that keep sort of making incursions that maybe we just need to deal with for once and for all? What do you most closely associate yourself with now? Do you find yourself in the 80% of life where it's preparatory and God is doing something inside of you? Or are you in the 20% where you felt this holy indignation rise up inside of you and something inside you said, this is not right, either within you or the world around you? Are there any stones you need to kneel down in a place of vulnerability and risk? Pick up. Our worship leaders are going to come and lead us in worship. We're going to give you a chance to reflect on these things, and there's three different ways you might respond to these questions into our conversation today. One, you can just sit there, and you can talk with the God of heaven and earth and deal with these questions or anything else that's come up. The other possibility is you can come up here and take communion. You can take the bread which represents the body of Christ, dip it in the juice which represents the blood of Christ, the Jesus that was crucified and was then resurrected, that gives power to the shaping and the forming and the transformation, gives power to us to confront the big deals in our life. That's another possibility. And the third possibility is after a few minutes, we're going to have people on the side over here that will pray with you. And if you're someone like me, I like to go wherever I need to go with somebody else. And they will be more than happy to talk with you and to God with you at that point.